So let us continue the lecture. We are now going to discuss necrotizing enterocolitis. Necrotizing enterocolitis is most common in premature infants, with the incidence of the disease being inversely proportional to the gestational age. It occurs in approximately 1 out of 10 very low birth weight infants. When you say very low birth weight, the weight is less than 1,500 grams. The pathogenesis of necrotizing enterocolitis is uncertain, but is in all likelihood multifactorial. In addition to prematurity, most cases are associated with enteral feeding, suggesting that some postnatal insult, such as introduction of bacteria, sets in motion the cascade culminating in tissue destruction. While infectious agents likely play a role in the pathogenesis of necrotizing enterocolitis, no single bacterial pathogen has been linked to the disease. A large number of inflammatory mediators have been associated with necrotizing enterocolitis. So as the inflammation is happening, you are expecting that there will be tissue necrosis, mucosal barrier breakdown, bacterial entry. Among the mediators, one particular mediator is the platelet activating factor. It has been implicated in increasing mucosal permeability by promoting enterocyte apoptosis and compromising intercellular tight junctions. Stool and serum samples of infants with necrotizing enterocolitis demonstrate higher platelet activating factor levels than age-matched controls. So as the breakdown of mucosal barrier functions permits transluminal migration of the gut bacteria, it leads to a vicious cycle of inflammation, mucosal necrosis, and further bacterial entry. So the bowel loops are dilated, it is thinned out, it is necrotic. So eventually, it may lead to perforation and eventual peritonitis. So patient may eventually culminate into sepsis and die of septic shock. So the clinical course is fairly typical. You have bloody stools at onset, you've got abdominal distension, you have development of circulatory collapse. And when you do an abdominal x-ray, the characteristic findings will demonstrate the gas in the intestinal wall. And this is what we call as pneumatosis intestinalis. It typically involves the terminal ileum, the cecum, the right colon, although any part of the small and large intestine may also be involved. The involved segment, as I have mentioned, is expected to be distended, friable, congested, necrotic, frankly gangrenous necrosis, so that intestinal perforation with accompanying peritonitis may follow. Sepsis sets in, and eventually, as I have said, the patient may die of septic shock. Microscopically, you are expecting mucosal or transmural coagulative necrosis, ulceration, bacterial colonization, even reparative changes such as the formation of granulation tissue and fibrosis. So what is the treatment? Often it would require resection of the necrotic segments of the bowel. Necrotizing enterocolitis is associated with high perinatal mortality. Strictures from fibrosis is usually brought about by complications of the healing process. So again, this is an image that I have taken from another source just to show you the distended abdomen. This is basically, again, showing you the film, which would be pneumatosis intestinalis. So let's proceed with the next part of the chapter, which is perinatal infection. In general, fetal and perinatal infection are acquired through one of two primary routes. It can either be transcervical, this is also known as ascending, or it can be transplacental, this is also known as hematologic. Occasionally, infections occur by a combination of the two routes, in that an ascending microorganism infects the endometrium and then invades the bloodstream via the chorionic villi. Let us talk first about transcervical or ascending infection. Most bacterial and a few viral, particularly herpes simplex 2 infections, are acquired by the cervicovaginal route. Such infections may be acquired in utero or around the time of birth. In general, the fetus acquires the infection either by inhaling amniotic fluid into the lungs shortly before birth or by passing through an infected birth canal during delivery. As stated before, the preterm birth is a common and unfortunate consequence of infection. Preterm birth due to infection may be related either to damage and rupture of amniotic sac as a direct consequence of the inflammation or to the induction of labor by prostaglandins released from infiltrating neutrophils. Inflammation of the placental membranes, which as I have said a while ago is called chorioamnionitis, and the cord, which is termed as phenycitis, are usually seen. But the presence or absence and severity of chorioamnionitis do not necessarily correlate with the severity of the fetal infection. In the fetus infected by inhalation of amniotic fluid, pneumonia, sepsis, and meningitis are the most common sequelae. Secondly would be your hematogenous infection as route of your perinatal infection. Most parasitic, like toxoplasma and malaria, and viral infections and few bacterial infections like Listeria and Treponema gain access to the fetal bloodstream transplacentally via the chorionic villi. This hematogenous transmission may occur at any time during gestation or occasionally, as may be the case with hepatitis B and HIV, at the time of delivery via maternal to fetal transfusion. The clinical manifestations of these infections are highly variable, depending largely on the gestational timing and microorganism involved. Parvovirus B19, which causes erythema infectiosum, or fifth disease of childhood in immunocompetent older children, can infect 1 to 5% of seronegative pregnant women, and the vast majority do have a normal pregnancy outcome. However, adverse pregnancy outcome may also happen in a minority of intrauterine infection, and this would include spontaneous abortion, which is particularly occurring in the second trimester, stillbirth, hydrops fetalis, and congenital anemia. Parvovirus B19 is a particular tropism for erythroid cells, and diagnostic viral inclusions can be seen in early erythroid progenitors in infected infants. The TORCH group of infection are grouped together because they evoke similar clinical and pathologic manifestations as it is enumerated here. Such infections occurring early in gestation may also cause chronic sequelae in the child, including growth and mental retardation, cataracts, congenital cardiac anomalies, and bone defects. So when we're talking of perinatal sepsis, it can be grouped clinically based on the onset. Is it within the first 7 days of life? Thereby it is called early onset. Or is it from 7 days to 3 months? This is what you call as late onset. Most cases of early onset sepsis are acquired at or shortly before birth, and they tend to result in clinical signs and symptoms of pneumonia, sepsis, and occasionally meningitis within 4 to 5 days of life. Group B streptococcus is the most common cause of early onset sepsis, as well as early onset bacterial meningitis. Infections with Listeria and Candida have long latent periods between the time of microorganism inoculation and the appearance of clinical symptoms. Thereby, it is called as a late onset sepsis. So we are now in the portion of the chapter that deals with fetal hydropes. When you say fetal hydropes, it refers to the accumulation of edema fluid. So again, when you see these words, fetal hydropes, the second thing that you should remember would be edema fluid. is the accumulation of edema fluid in the fetus during intrauterine growth. Until recently, hemolytic anemia caused by Rh blood group incompatibility between mother and fetus was the most common cause. But with successful prophylaxis of the disorder during pregnancy, causes of non-immune hydropes have emerged as principal culprits. The intrauterine fluid accumulation can be variable from progressive generalized edema of the fetus. This is what we call as hydrops fetalis, which is usually lethal, to a more localized degree of edema isolated in cavities, like for example, the pleural and the peritoneal cavity, or postnuchal fluid accumulation. This is otherwise termed as cystic hygroma, which are all compatible with life. Let's tackle first the first one, which is immune hydropes. Immune hydropes is a hemolytic disease which is caused by blood group antigen incompatibility between mother and the fetus. When the fetus inherits the red cell antigenic determinants from the father that are foreign to the mother, a maternal immune reaction may occur. The major antigens known to induce clinically significant immunologic reactions are Rh antigens and the ABO blood groups. The reaction occurs in second and subsequent pregnancies in Rh negative mother with an Rh positive father. The underlying basis of immune hydropes is the immunization of the mother by a blood group antigen on fetal red cells and the free passage of antibodies from the mother to the placenta to the fetus. Again, it is the passage of antibodies from the mother through the placenta to the fetus. Fetal red cells may reach the maternal circulation during the last trimester of pregnancy, when the cytotrophoblast is no longer present as a barrier, or during childbirth itself. The mother thus becomes sensitized to the foreign antigen. Let's take, for example, here. The initial exposure to Rh antigen evokes the formation of IgM antibodies. But unlike IgG antibodies do not cross the placenta, thus Rh disease is uncommon with the first pregnancy. Exposure during a subsequent pregnancy generally leads to a brisk IgG antibody response and the risk of immune hydropes. Of the numerous antigens in the Rh system, only the D antigen is a major cause of Rh incompatibility. Several factors influence the immune response to Rh positive fetal red cells that reach the maternal circulation. So again, the bottom line is antibodies from the mother will pass through the placenta, going to the fetus, attacking the red cells of the fetus. Now, let's again take a look at this. So your O, you have naturally occurring anti-A and anti-B. So the anti-A can attack your A cells, the anti-B can attack your B cells, thereby leading to hemolysis. Concurrent ABO incompatibility protects the mother against Rh immunization because the fetal red cells are promptly coated and removed from the maternal circulation by anti-A or anti-B antibodies that do not cross the placenta. The antibody response depends on the dose of immunizing antigen. Hence, hemolytic disease develops only when the mother has experienced a significant transplacental bleed, approximately around more than 1 ml of Rh positive fetal red cells. The incidence of maternal Rh isoimmunization has decreased significantly since the use of rhesus immune globulin. We have what you call as RHIG or rhesus immune globulin containing anti-D antibodies. Administration of rhesus immune globulin at 28 weeks and within 72 hours of delivery to Rh negative mothers significantly decreases the risk of hemolytic disease in Rh positive neonates and in subsequent pregnancies. Rh immunoglobulin is also administered following abortion because this can lead to immunization. The pathogenesis of fetal hemolysis caused by maternal ABO incompatibility is slightly different from that caused by differences in the Rh antigen. ABO incompatibility occurs in approximately 20 to 25% of pregnancies, but laboratory evidence of hemolytic disease occurs only in 1 out of 10 such infants, and the hemolytic disease is severe enough to require treatment in only 1 in 200 cases. So as you can see, the incidence of hemolysis is not so remarkable. But then again, several factors account for this. First, most anti-A and anti-B antibodies are of the IgM types, so they do not cross the placenta. Secondly, neonatal red cells express blood group antigens A and B poorly. Third, many cells other than red cells express A and B antigens and thus absorb some of the transferred antibody. ABO hemolytic disease occurs almost exclusively in infants of group A or B who are born of group O mothers. For reasons unknown, certain group O women possesses IgG antibodies directed against group A or B antigens for both, even without prior sensitization. Therefore, the firstborn may be affected. Fortunately, even with transplacentally acquired antibodies, lysis of the infant's red cell is minimal. There is no effective protection against ABO reaction. There are two consequences of excessive destruction of red cells in the neonate, which I will discuss in the next slide. So again, this is just an illustration of what I have been explaining. For RH, the mother is RH negative, the fetus is RH positive. We're expecting that the anemia and eventually the jaundice that happens because of lysis of red cells will then cause several complications on the child. Like for example, the anemia would bring about extramedullary hematopoiesis and cardiac decompensation. Eventually, you will see the classic edema in the fetus. As the red cells are lysed, your bilirubin goes up, so jaundice is inevitable, and eventually it will lead to a condition called kernicterus that I will be discussing a little later. So the two consequences, again, would be anemia and jaundice. Red cell lysis, of course, will lead to anemia. It is a direct result of red cell lysis. If hemolysis is mild, increased red cell production may suffice to maintain near normal levels of red cells. However, with more severe hemolysis, progressive anemia may develop and result in hypoxic injury to the heart and the liver. Because of liver injury, the plasma protein synthesis decreases. Again, the plasma protein synthesis decreases so that the levels of this protein may drop to as low as 2 to 2.5 milligrams per DL. Why are we emphasizing that? Because as I have mentioned, or as I have shown you in the previous slide, hydrops is expected to happen. So when your protein goes down because of the liver involvement, then you are expecting that edema is one of the manifestations that you will see among your patients. Cardiac hypoxia may lead to cardiac decompensation and failure. The combination of reduced plasma oncotic pressure and increased hydrostatic pressure of the circulation, secondary to the cardiac failure, will result in generalized edema and anasarca culminating in hydrops fetalis. So as the red cells are lysed, jaundice developed because the hemolysis will produce unconjugated bilirubin. Bilirubin also passes through the infant's blood-brain barrier. Being water insoluble, bilirubin binds to lipids in the brain and can damage the CNS, causing what we call as kernicterus. So what are the expected causes of non-immune hydrops? Non-immune hydrops are divided into three. You have cardiovascular defects, chromosomal anomalies, and fetal anemia. The three major causes. Both structural and functional cardiovascular defects, such as congenital malformation and arrhythmia, may result in intrauterine cardiac failure and hydrops. Among the chromosomal anomalies, Turner syndrome 45X and trisomies 21 and 18 are associated with fetal hydrops because of the accompanying structural cardiac anomalies. In turn, Turner syndrome, abnormalities of lymphatic drainage from the neck, may lead to postnuchal fluid accumulation. This is what we call a cystic hydroma. Fetal anemia, not caused by Rh negative or ABO-associated antibodies, can also result in hydrops. As you can see here, you have thalassemia, alpha thalassemia, resulting from deletion of all 4 globin chains, which is probably the most common cause of non-immune hydrops. Parvovirus B19, which is a rapidly emerging important cause of hydrops. The virus gains preferential entry into erythroid precursors, which we call as normoblast, where it replicates, leading to apoptosis of red cell progenitors and isolated red cell aplasia. Parvoviral intranuclear inclusions can be seen within circulating and marrow erythroid precursors. Approximately 10% of cases of non-immune hydrops are related to monozygous twin pregnancies and twin-to-twin transfusion occurring through anastomosis between the 2 circulations. The most serious threat in fetal hydrops is CNS damage, known as kernicterus. The affected brain is expected to be enlarged and edematous, and when section will give you a bright yellow color, particularly in the basal ganglia, thalamus, cerebellum, cerebral gray matter, and the spinal cord. The precise level of bilirubin that induces kernicterus is unpredictable, but neural damage usually requires a blood bilirubin level greater than 20 mg per deciliter. In term infants, in premature infants, this threshold may be considerably lower. So the expected manifestation would then be varying with the severity of the disease. Minimally affected infants will display pallor, possibly accompanied by hepatosplenomegaly, to which we can also add jaundice, of course. Whereas the most gravely ill neonates may present with intense jaundice, generalized edema, and signs of neurologic injury. These infants may be supported by a variety of measures, like phototherapy. The principle behind is that the visual light oxidizes toxic unconjugated bilirubin to harm less readily excreted water-soluble dibirones, and in severe cases, total exchange transfusion of the infant. Okay, so we are now showing you again an example of hydrops fetalis. More likely this baby to have Turner's because characteristically the baby is exhibiting webbing of the neck. Let us go now to the inborn errors of metabolism. Inborn errors of metabolism are well-characterized genetic abnormalities that give rise to metabolic disorders. There are 3 genetic disorders of metabolism discussed in the book, which is phenylketonuria, galactosemia, and cystic fibrosis. PKU and galactosemia is particularly important, and with appropriate dietary regimen, early death or mental retardation can be prevented. Cystic fibrosis is one of the most common potentially lethal disease, usually occurring in individuals of Caucasian descent. So let's talk about phenylketonuria. There are several variants of this inborn error of metabolism, which affects 1 in 10,000 live-born Caucasian infants. The most common form is classic phenylketonuria, which is basically inherited as an autosomal recessive disorder. It is caused by a severe deficiency of the enzyme phenylalanine hydroxylase and the resultant hyperphenylalaninemic hyperinsulinemia. The affected infants are normal at birth, but within a few weeks develop a rising plasma phenylalanine level, which impairs the brain development. Usually, by 6 months of age, there is severe mental retardation. Fewer than 4% of untreated phenylketonuria children have IQs greater than 50 or 60. About one-third of these children are never able to walk, and two-thirds cannot talk. Seizures, other neurologic abnormalities, decreased skin pigmentation of hair in the skin often accompany the mental retardation in untreated children. Hyperphenylalaninemia and the resultant mental retardation can be avoided by restricting phenylalanine intake early in life. There are several screening procedures and routinely performed to detect PKU in the immediate postnatal period. Many female PKU patients, if treated with dietary restriction early in life, reach childbearing age and are clinically asymptomatic. Most of them have marked hyperphenylalaninemia because dietary treatment is discontinued after they reach adulthood. Between 75 and 90% of children born to such women are mentally retarded and microcephalic. 15% will have congenital heart disease, even though the infants themselves are heterozygous. This syndrome is termed as maternal PKU. It results from the teratogenic effects of phenylalanine or its metabolites that cross the placenta and affect specific fetal organs during development. The presence and severity of the fetal anomalies directly correlate with the maternal phenylalanine level. So it is imperative that maternal dietary restriction of phenylalanine be initiated before conception and continued throughout pregnancy. The biochemical abnormality in PKU is inability to convert phenylalanine into tyrosine. Again, inability to convert phenylalanine into tyrosine. In normal children, less than 50% of the dietary intake of phenylalanine is necessary for protein synthesis. The remainder is converted to tyrosine by the phenylalanine hydroxylase system. When phenylalanine metabolism is blocked because of the lack of PAH, minor shunt pathways come into play, yielding several intermediates that are excreted in large amounts in the urine and in the sweat. This will then impart a strong musty or mousy odor to the affected infants. It is believed that excess phenylalanine or its metabolite contribute to the brain damage in PKU. Concomitant lack of tyrosine, which is a precursor of melanin, is responsible for the light color of the hair and the skin. At the molecular level, approximately 500 mutant alleles of the PAH gene have been identified, only some of which can cause a severe deficiency of the enzyme and thus result in classic PKU. Infants with mutation resulting in complete lack of PAH activity present with the classic features of PKU, while those with up to 60% residual activity presents with milder form of the disease. So this is an example of a child with PKU. As I have mentioned, you're expecting that the phenylalanine level as it goes up, okay, would lead to tyrosine problem linked to melanin. So often they have light pigmentation. The skin is fair, the hair is basically blonde, and these are examples of babies who were diagnosed to have PKU. Let's go now to the next one, which is galactosemia. It is also autosomal recessive. It is a disorder of galactose metabolism, which results in the accumulation of galactose 1-phosphate in tissues. Normally, the lactose, which is the major carbohydrate in mammalian milk, is split into glucose and galactose, which is then converted to glucose in 3 steps. There are 2 variants of galactosemia. The more common variant is wherein there is a total lack of galactose 1-phosphate uridyl transferase, which is involved in reaction 2. The rare variant arises from deficiency of galactokinase, which is involved in reaction 1. Because galactokinase deficiency leads to milder form of the disease, it is not associated with mental retardation. As a result of the transferase deficiency, galactose 1 phosphate accumulates in many locations, including the liver, the spleen, the eyes, the cerebral cortex, and erythrocytes. Alternative metabolic pathways are activated, leading to the production of galactitol and galactonate, which is an oxidized byproduct of excess galactose, both of which can also accumulate in the tissue. Long-term toxicity in galactosemia has been variously imputed to these metabolic intermediates. So the clinical picture is variable, which is probably reflecting the heterogeneity of the mutation in the galactose 1 phosphate uridyl transferase. So the clinical picture, again, the liver, the eyes, the brain bear the brunt of the damage. The early to develop hepatomegaly is due largely to fatty change, but in time, widespread scarring that closely resembles cirrhosis of alcohol abuse may supervene. There is opacification of the lens. Cataract will develop, probably because the lens absorbs water and swells as galactitol. It is produced by alternative metabolic pathways, accumulates and increases the osmotic pressure. Non-specific alteration will appear in the central nervous system, including loss of nerve cells, gliosis, and edema, particularly in the dentate nuclei of the cerebellum and the olivary nuclei of the medulla. Similar changes may occur in the cerebral cortex and the white matter. So the infants too have failure to thrive almost from birth. Vomiting and diarrhea appear within a few days of milk ingestion. Jaundice and hepatomegaly usually become evident during the first week of life and may seem to be a continuation of the physiologic jaundice of the newborn. The cataracts will develop within a few weeks, and within the first 6 to 12 months of life, mental retardation may be detected. Even in untreated infants, the mental deficit is usually not severe, as seen in PKU. Accumulation of galactose and galactose 1 phosphate in the kidney impairs amino acid transport, resulting in aminoaciduria. There is increased frequency of fulminant E. coli septicemia, which is possibly arising from depressed neutrophil bactericidal activity. Hemolysis and coagulopathy of the newborn period can occur as well. So again, these are the things that I just enumerated for galactosemia. So next would be cystic fibrosis or mucoviscidosis. So the next topic would be cystic fibrosis. It is an inherited disorder of iron transport that affects fluid secretion in exocrine glands and in the epithelial lining of the respiratory, gastrointestinal, and reproductive tracts. In many individuals, this disorder leads to abnormally viscous secretion, hence the term mucoviscidosis, which obstruct organ passages, resulting in most of the clinical features of this disorder, such as the chronic lung disease secondary to recurrent infection, pancreatic insufficiency, steatorrhea, malnutrition, hepatic cirrhosis, intestinal obstruction, and male infertility. The manifestations I have just enumerated may appear at any point in life, from before birth to much later in childhood, or even in adolescence. The problem here in cystic fibrosis is an abnormal function of epithelial chloride channel protein encoded by the CFTR gene in chromosome 7. The CFTR gene regulates the chloride channel, potassium channel, the sodium channel, gap junction channel, and cellular process involved in ATP transport and mucus secretion. In normal duct epithelia, the chloride is transported by plasma membrane channel or chloride channel. The primary defect in cystic fibrosis results from abnormal function of an epithelial chloride channel protein encoded by the cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator, which is located in chromosome 7. The amino acid polypeptide encoded by CFTR has two transmembrane domain, two cytoplasmic nucleotide binding domain, and a regulatory domain that contains protein kinase A and C phosphorylation site. The two transmembrane domain form a channel through which chloride passes. Activation of the CFTR channel is mediated by agonist-induced increases in cyclic adenosine monophosphate, followed by activation of protein kinase A that phosphorylates the R domain. ATP triphosphate binding and hydrolysis of the NBD is essential for opening and closing of the channel pore in response to cyclic AMP-mediated signaling. So, CFTR regulates multiple additional ion channels and cellular process. It is initially characterized as a chloride conductance channel. It is now recognized that CFTR can regulate multiple ion channels and cellular process primarily through interaction involving its nucleotide binding domains. This includes chloride channel, potassium channel, epithelial sodium channel. Again, this is epithelial sodium channel, gap junction channels, and cellular process involved in ATP transport and mucus secretion. Of this, interaction of CFTR with the epithelial sodium channel has possibly the most pathophysiologic relevance in cystic fibrosis. Again, let me repeat that. The interaction of CFTR with the epithelial sodium channel has possibly the most pathophysiologic relevance in cystic fibrosis. The epithelial sodium channel is situated on the apical surface of exocrine epithelial cells and is responsible for sodium uptake from the luminal fluid, rendering it hypotonic. The epithelial sodium channel is inhibited by normally functioning CFTR. Hence, in cystic fibrosis, epithelial sodium channel activity increases markedly, augmenting sodium uptake across the apical membrane. The importance of this phenomenon is discussed, or basically is the one responsible for pulmonary and GI pathology that is seen in patients with cystic fibrosis, except in the human sweat duct, where epithelial sodium channel activity decreases. Again, in the sweat duct, the epithelial sodium activity decreases as a result of CFTR mutation. Therefore, a hypertonic luminal fluid containing high sweat sodium chloride, which is the sine qua non of classic cystic fibrosis, is formed. This is the basis for the salty sweat that mothers can often detect in their affected infants. The function of CFTR are tissue-specific. Therefore, the impact of mutation in CFTR is also tissue-specific. The major function of CFTR in the sweat gland ducts is to reabsorb luminal chloride ions and augment sodium reabsorption via the epithelial sodium channel. Therefore, in the sweat ducts, loss of CFTR function leads to decreased reabsorption of sodium chloride and production of hypertonic sweat. However, in the respiratory and intestinal epithelium, the CFTR is one of the most important avenues for active luminal secretion of chloride. At these sites, CFTR mutation result in loss or reduction of fluoride secretion into the lumen. Active luminal sodium reabsorption is increased due to loss of inhibition of epithelial sodium channel activity. And both of these ion changes increase passive water reabsorption from the lumen, lowering the water content of the surface fluid layer coating mucosal cells. Thus, unlike the sweat ducts, there is no difference in the salt concentration of the surface fluid layer coating the respiratory and intestinal mucosal cells in normal individuals versus those with cystic fibrosis. Instead, the pathogenesis of respiratory and intestinal complication in cystic fibrosis seems to stem from an isotonic but low volume surface fluid layer. In the lungs, the dehydration leads to defective mucociliary action and accumulation of concentrated viscid secretion, which obstruct the passages and predispose the patient to recurrent pulmonary infection. So again, what are the effects of CFTR mutation? You have increased activity of epithelial sodium channel causing increased sodium uptake, which blocks the ducts in the pulmonary and increases the secretion in the GIT. Defective ciliary infection predisposes the patient to recurrent infection, particularly in the lungs. In the sweat glands, you'll have salty sweat, as I have emphasized. You have formation of acidic fluid and fluid secretion of exocrine gland in the lining epithelium of the different organs. So this is a table that is directly lifted in your book, which gives you the different types of CFTR. So you have normal, class 1, class 2, class 3, 4, 5, and 6. Please take time to review this. Again, these are the different variants of cystic fibrosis. So how do you diagnose the disease? In most cases, the diagnosis of cystic fibrosis is based on persistently elevated sweat chloride electrolyte concentration. Often the mother makes a diagnosis by recognizing her infant's abnormally salty sweat. But of course, the gold standard would be sequencing of the CFTR gene. We have the characteristic clinical findings. I have added it here. This is from another reference, just to remind you that you will have manifestation, particularly in the sinopulmonary area, gastrointestinal manifestation. So these are some of the clinical findings that you would expect to see in patients with cystic fibrosis. Okay, let us go now to the next entity, which is sudden infant death syndrome. Sudden infant death syndrome is defined as sudden death of an infant under 1 year of age, which remains unexplained after a thorough case investigation, including performance of a complete autopsy, examination of the death scene, and review of the clinical history. It is important to emphasize that many cases of sudden death in infancy may have an unexpected anatomic or biochemical basis, which can be seen on autopsy. And these cases should not be labeled as SIDS, but rather should be labeled as sudden unexpected infant death. SUID. If you have identified something on autopsy, SUID is the right label for your patient. An aspect of SIDS that is not stressed in the definition is that the infant usually dies while asleep, mostly in the prone or side position. Hence, it is also known as crib death or cot death. What is the cause? We actually have what we call as the triple risk model. The overlapping factors are as the following. One is the vulnerable infant. Two would be the critical developmental period in homeostatic control. And three would be an exogenous stressor. According to this model, there are several factors which makes the infant vulnerable to sudden death prior to critical developmental period. These vulnerability factors may relate to the parents or the infant, while the exogenous stressors are environmental. While numerous factors have been proposed to account for a vulnerable infant, the most compelling hypothesis is that SIDS reflects a delayed development of arousal and cardiorespiratory control. The brainstem, and in particular the medulla oblongata, plays a critical role in the body's arousal and response to noxious stimuli, such as episodic hypercarbia, hypoxia, and thermal stress encountered during sleep. The serotonergic system of the medulla is implicated in these arousal responses, as well as regulation of other critical homeostatic functions such as respiratory drive, blood pressure, and upper airway reflexes. Abnormalities in serotonin-dependent signaling in the brainstem may be the underlying basis for SIDS in some infants. So, the infants who are born before term, low birth weight, are at increased risk, and risk increases with decreasing gestational age or birth weight. Male sex is associated with a greater incidence of SIDS. SIDS in prior sibling is associated with a 5-fold relative risk of recurrence, highlighting the importance of genetic predisposition. Traumatic child abuse must be carefully excluded under these circumstances. Among the potential environmental stressors, prone or sleeping position, sleeping with parents at first 3 months, sleeping on soft surfaces, and thermal stress are probably the most important modifiable risk factor for SIDS. The prone or side position predisposes an infant to one or more recognized noxious stimuli, like hypoxia, hypercarbia, and thermal stress during sleep. The side position was considered a reliable alternative to the prone sleeping position, but the American Academy of Pediatrics now recognize the supine sleeping position as the only safe position that reduces the risk of SIDS. This is an example of a back to sleep campaign which resulted in substantial reduction in SIDS-related death since its inception. Okay, we are now in the last portion of the chapter, which is tumors and tumor-like condition. I would like to give you again a short break before we proceed further.